Okay, we've just turned on the webinar and we're waiting as folks join us. Welcome to the session. We have 5 more minutes before we start, so please feel free to make yourself comfortable and get a glass of water or whatever it is you need to get settled. And we'll begin in about 5 minutes. We've got about close to 200 people registered for this session, so it'll be very exciting to have people from across the country joining us tonight. I am right in the downtown area and I have to keep my mic on for this period of time. And I'm really hoping that no ambulances or fire trucks go by. Welcome everyone. I see that more people are joining. We're very happy to have you here tonight. Welcome to those of you who are just joining us. We're waiting for a couple more minutes until the hour turns and then we'll begin the session. We thought we would turn the session on a little bit early so that we could make things load up a little bit more quickly. But perhaps people are accustomed to coming right on the hour to start Zoom meetings now. We had a lovely day in Vancouver here today. It was really sunny and it's so exciting to be getting some of that bright light now at this time of the year. We even have some buds on the cherry trees. And we have folks still joining us, so we're waiting a little bit more till we begin the session. A little shout out to Trish there. Welcome everyone. We're just going to give you another minute to join up and we'll begin the session then. And so we're at 6:31 now, so we will begin the session. Good evening, everyone. Greetings to you from our family here at the British Columbia's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. We're so happy that you were able to take some time to meet with us this evening to speak about or to hear about some of the work that's being done around the collection of race-based and disaggregated data, the grandmother's perspective. My name is Sharon Thera, and I am standing here today in Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam territory in downtown Vancouver. We'd like you to take a few minutes and add your name to the chat if you'd like to, and any kind of greeting if you'd like to add one, or information about where you're joining us from. We're always interested to know where folks are calling in from. If you'd like to add into the chat as well, it would be nice for us to know what you were hoping to get out of today's conversation. So it would be really helpful to us if you wanted to and felt comfortable enough to add to the chat there today. Hello, John, welcome. We've got Tanya from Maple Ridge and from Port Coquitlam, from 100 Mile, Colleen, Rabia from Richmond. I hope I said that right. I apologize if I didn't. And Heather from Karameas. Welcome, Heather. And Gila Kasla. Rachel's joining us from Musqueam. And Zena from Vancouver. Oh, you're moving so fast. Calgary, Saturna Island, Jessica, welcome. Thank you so much, everyone. As you continue to put your names in, I'd like to introduce Elder Shane Point to you. Shane is from the people of the Grass, the Musqueam people, who have lived in this traditional territory, which is now called Vancouver, and all of the surrounding areas in this area for thousands of years. Some of their stories, their ancient stories, describe the landscape as it was thousands of years ago. And so welcome to Shane Point from the people of the Grass.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I'd like to start by saying here in Coast Salish territory, which encompasses more than likely, at the very least, 20 different villages: Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Tsawwassen, Catesy, many more. Historically here, it's important for you to know that data collection was most important. How many fish returned? How many berry fields are there? How many streams? How many salmon-bearing streams? How many clam beds? How many places to get prawns? How many orcas are in the area? So we've been collecting data for thousands and thousands of years, so we have sustainability up until Europeans got here and up until most recently, not worried about data collection. So we, as Salish people and many other First Nations people across Turtle Island, we're constantly collecting data because it's important to the not only sustenance of life, but life itself. So with that, I'm going to chant in my language When I'm finished, I'll explain the words. See you when and what hooks in squall wind, Mamina, quam fit Mamina. Oh, In the chant, my dear relatives and friends, I'm asking the infinite and our collective ancestors to please open our hearts and open our minds to what it is that we're going to hear today. Not only to open, but to retain the information so that we can redistribute it at another time because of its importance. I'm also asking for strength for all of us to come to the same place that I'm at. Nutsamot. Nutsamot, Coast Salish language, simply means we are one. We are one. So, Nutsamot, Shqualawit, my friends and my relatives, we are one heart and one mind. I want to say in closing, I heard the word grandmother, grandmother's perspective. Grandmother's perspective is of the utmost importance. The gifts that I received at an early age, 4, 5, 6 years old, came from my grandmother. My mother's mother, Clopenup, gifted me, gave to me, treasured. My grandmother, my grandfather's second wife, Grandma Adeline, gave to me gifts, treasures. It's from our grandmothers that we receive. We receive from others, of course, but treasures come from those wonderful human beings in our lives called grandmothers. So please, all of you, keep your ears and your eyes open. Keep your heart open to what it is you're going to hear today. It was a great honor and a privilege for me to be asked to open this very important dialogue. So I'm grateful to Sharon and her team. I'm going to listen for a while to Gwen to hear what she has to say because it's important. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Not so much, Shane. Hojka. And I said thank you to Elder Shane Point for opening our session in such a good way today. I want to spend a little bit of time going over the agenda for you, and then we will move directly into the presentation. The agenda consists of the introduction, the presentation, and then a period for questioning afterwards. The presentation will be about 45 minutes long. Each presenter will be presenting for about 15 minutes. I'd like to just draw your attention to the chat protocol. We've had some difficulty with chats in the past, and we want to keep you safe in this process. And so if there are instances where negative things are being said in the chat section, we will move to remove folks from the chat room. Just want to let you know that we are keeping your safety at the utmost. I'd like to just introduce the Office of BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. We were reinstated in 2019 with the appointment of our new commissioner, Kasari Govender, not so new maybe anymore. And our office exists to address the root causes of inequality, discrimination, and injustice in BC by shifting laws, policies, practices, and cultures. We do this work through research, education, advocacy, inquiries, and monitoring. At this time, we're going to launch a little poll. And we would like to just get a quick bit of information from you. And I noticed a question coming in from the chat that asking about whether you could turn your screens on. The screen function is not available in our webinars, in Zoom webinars, and so only the panelists are available. I want to just let you know while you're doing the poll that some of the material that we cover today may be difficult to hear. It may ring close to your heart or to your experience. We want you to know that when we speak about the information that we share tonight, that it's with the interest of making the situation better. We want you to take care of yourself. If any of this information is triggering to you, if it causes you any distress, please take time that you need away from this process and join us again when you're able to. Please do take care of yourself in this process. And so now I'm going to ask Emily to share some of the results of the poll. And I think you can see there that we have folks from nonprofit organizations, from government, and from a lot of individuals joining us today. Thank you very much for taking part in that. With that, I'd like to introduce the panelists. We have tonight Kasari Govender, who is the commissioner, the Human Rights Commissioner in BC. She joined us in 2019, as I mentioned. She has devoted most of her life to promoting human rights with a focus on the rights of the most marginalized. We also have Trish Garner joining us, who's the Executive Director of Research and Policy at the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. And they, of course, are a tea-swilling Brit with a passion for social justice. We also have Gwen Phillips, who is a BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative champion. She's a citizen of the Ktunaxa Nation and has worked for the Ktunaxa Nation Council for the past 37 years. Welcome to our speakers, and passing it over to Kasari.
Thank you, Sharon, for that welcome. Thank you, Shane, for starting us off in such a wonderful way and calling our grandmothers into this space. My grandmother taught me a lot of what I know and who I am, and so I appreciate that reminder. And thank you to all of you who have taken some time out on your evening to join us and talk about this topic. I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments as we move through this. Trish and Gwen and I will be splitting our time here today to talk about the importance of race-based and other disaggregated data collection and what it may mean for our institutions and perhaps your work for those of you who work in these institutions and services. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from what's now known as Vancouver, from the unceded and traditional homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. As a descendant of migrants and settlers, and as the Human Rights Commissioner for this province, I am very grateful to the Coast Salish peoples who have cared for this land and this water for so many generations. It's an honor to be here with all of you today, speaking on this topic on this beautiful land. So while the pandemic leaves us all in a continual state of uncertainty, I clearly share with all of you a belief that this is a crucial time to continue to be gathering to talk about the important social issues of our day, particularly racism as it plays out around us. The collection of race-based and other disaggregated data has particular urgency in this moment. The pandemic has both exacerbated and exposed deep social inequities, and many of the issues we are struggling with have far-reaching human rights implications. Data-based stories or narratives are uniquely positioned to make change by speaking a language that those in power can understand. The goal of disaggregated data collection is to identify inequalities and advance human rights in Canada and to combat the COVID-19 pandemic through the collection of statistical data that is mapped on to social inequities. As consumers of media, we all know that individual stories are powerful and can illustrate the larger injustices in our culture. Disaggregated data tells the larger story of inequality in the province and reveals the collective power of story to make change. Next slide, please. Thank you. BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, as you've heard, was reinstated in September 2019, marking the first time in 17 years that this province has had a public body with the mandate to investigate and eliminate systemic discrimination in our social structures. One of our proudest accomplishments to date is one that I'm hopeful will make a significant contribution to uprooting systemic sexism and racism and other forms of discrimination longer term. This, of course, is the issue of data-driven human rights work that we are, of course, here to speak to you about today and speak with you about today. On June 5th, 2020, we joined Human Rights Commissions across the country in calling on all jurisdictions in Canada to start collecting race-based and other disaggregated data, particularly in relation to COVID. We joined a chorus of community voices who have all been calling for the collection of this data to address systemic discrimination, both in this particular moment of crisis in our world, in our country, in our province, but also going forward as a way to improve social policy and address ingrained inequalities. In mid-June, Premier John Horgan invited me and our Information and Privacy Commissioner, Michael McAvoy, to provide recommendations on how to collect, store, use, and disclose disaggregated data in a way that furthers the aims of substantive social equality without reinforcing marginalization. And we're going to break this down quite a bit. The aims of substantive equality and the risks of potentially reinforcing marginalization. So as it says on the slide in front of you, disaggregated data generally provides subcategories of information, for example, by ethnic group, gender, occupation, educational status, and so on. These are sometimes called demographic categories. Unlike aggregate data, which groups information together, disaggregated data parses out information in a way that can reveal inequalities and relationships between categories of people and identities. Next slide, please. Disaggregated data is important because when policy, practice, and law are predicated on statistics, silences and omissions in data can cost human lives and human well-being. On the other hand, data that reveals the impacts of sexism, ableism, racism, and other forms of discrimination can act as a kind of tipping point for provincial government decision makers to take action. For example, in BC, disaggregated data collected during homeless counts have helped the province better address the needs of individuals experiencing homelessness through targeted programs that take into account age, indigeneity, sexuality, disability, and other demographics. So on September 15th, we published our report that shares our findings on how to ensure disaggregated data is collected and used in service of and in collaboration with those who are systemically discriminated against. The report, as you've heard, is called Disaggregated Demographic Data Collection in BC, the Grandmother Perspective. It is grounded in conversations that we had with communities and other experts, during which we heard loud and clear that colorblind approaches to policy making only worsen outcomes for Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, because we can't address what we don't see. But collecting and using disaggregated data is not without risks, and we must ensure that we do so responsibly so that we don't end up reinforcing problematic biases and stigma. As a starting point, we need to be clear that the project of collecting disaggregated data is about unpacking the impacts of racism rather than measuring race itself. As Dr. Danielle Ben-Smith, the Deputy Provincial Health Officer of Indigenous Health, said to us, we need to be explicit about what we're measuring with disaggregated data. We're not measuring inherent deficiencies in different groups. We're measuring the negative impacts of longstanding structural racism and social exclusion on the health of Indigenous and racialized peoples. In our consultations, we heard about the real risks that we face when we collect race-based and other disaggregated data, and we're cautioned against making the same mistakes that we've seen in history. So for example, Japanese internment, South Africa's apartheid system, our residential school system, and indeed the Indian Act itself is predicated on race-based data. So some significant risks there. Stigma is another significant risk. So for example, the Ontario Human Rights Commission is conducting an inquiry into racial profiling by the Toronto Police Service. In that inquiry, they have found, for example, that between 2013 and 2017, a Black person in Toronto was nearly 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting by the Toronto Police Service. As I'm not Black, of course, and I do have some cousins who are young Black men in Toronto, and even having that family connection, of course, I found this statistic absolutely shocking. But I recognize that for those who live this reality, this finding may not come as a surprise at all. Knowing this data alone without further analysis could lead to stigmatization that Black people are more likely to be a threat to police or more likely to be violent criminals. And therefore, the root of the violence against them is somehow their own behavior rather than being systemic racism. But importantly, the Ontario Commission's inquiry doesn't stop there. Their research reveals a lack of legal basis for police stopping or detaining Black civilians in the first place, inappropriate or unjustified searches during encounters, and unnecessary charges or arrests. The information analyzed by the Commission also raises broader concerns about officer misconduct, transparency, accountability of police in relation to their interactions with Black people. So it can begin to see the patterns, that the violence against Black people by the police is the cause of bias of the police rather than the behavior of those being targeted. This kind of causal analysis is essential to guarding against the increasing stigma of already marginalized communities. So you can hear there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong. Again, we heard this loud and clear from our community consultations. We have grappled very, very much with how to mitigate this harm in our report and our recommendations. In a moment, you will hear from Gwen herself. And in the meantime, I want to highlight something that she said to us in our consultation process, for which I am very grateful. She urged us to think of data collection from the perspective of a grandmother rather than a big brother. As you can see from even the title of our report, this conceptual framing provided an important container for our work in our report on data collection. In writing about the grandmother perspective, we caution that data must be collected only to advance social change, much as a grandmother or a matriarch might use her knowledge of her family to better care for them. So the underlying framework for our recommendations is that the collection of data must always be in service of addressing systemic inequality rather than just for the sake of data itself or for the sake of monitoring citizens. It must be always collected in the context of government's relationship to community. And a key part of this work is acknowledging that building respectful relationships must come first, because you can't have transformative change without that foundation. Our research used a human rights-based approach to arrive at the conclusion that communities must have some control over their own data sets to limit the chances of it being used to perpetuate racist divisions or to reinforce stigma. Our key recommendation is the one you can see in front of you now. It's the establishment of a legislative structure that would support the collection of disaggregated data in service of systemic equality, with the meaningful involvement of marginalized communities through the use of a community governance board. We were pleased to see our recommendation for new legislation reflected in the fall 2020 mandate letters of the Attorney General and the new Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism Initiatives. I very much believe that the careful curation and analysis of provincial pools of disaggregated data will help us surface collective experiences of systemic inequality and to forge new insights into intersections between groups, identities, and access to human rights. So with that, I'll turn it over to Trish to provide more details on the research, the framework for the report, and our recommendations. Over to you, Trish.
Thanks so much, Kasari. And I'd also like to echo Kasari's thanks for joining us this evening. Great to see so many people online with us. I'm also joining you from what's now known as Vancouver on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. First, I want to again thank Gwen Phillips of the Chinaaha Nation for gifting us her grandmother perspective as the fundamental principle for our work on disaggregated data. It is just such a powerful shift from control to care, and I'm so glad that you're going to get to hear directly from her tonight. I also can't thank enough the many other community members we spoke to, these community leaders and academic experts, and often both, have been driving this issue for decades, and they were so generous with their time and expertise. And I know some of you are joining us tonight, so you know who you are, and thanks very much. Kasari has gone through and outlined some of the risks and benefits of disaggregated data collection, use and disclosure. But I just want to start with a story of how those risks and benefits play out on my body. So as someone who's had chest surgery, but hasn't taken hormones, as someone who goes by my birth name of Trish, but Papa to my kids, as someone who identifies as non-binary and transgender, filling out one of those seemingly simple demographic surveys is not a simple task for me. As I read through the categories, I have this really emotional, visceral response. My heart beats faster, my stress levels go up. I know I'm real, but will the survey deny that by only including male or female, man or woman? And on the flip side, the feeling of safety to see myself in survey categories is overwhelming, and will really affect my response to that service, that program, that policy, whatever it might be. So I tell you this for a few reasons. So you know what's at stake here. In one way, a simple survey can lead to those intense feelings of danger or safety, and that has an impact on individuals and communities. So people will hide in the categories you give them. So participant safety gives you better data. I also tell you this so you can see how this was part of our research approach in recognizing who we are in relation to projects. And so you can build this into your methodology as you design projects. So here you can see the basic bones of what we did in our research over the 2-3 months we had last summer. I won't go into too much detail here, but in relation to that decolonizing and human rights-based approach, one of the ways we applied that is in denying that falsehood of the disembodied, neutral, objective researcher, just as I did just now. And this is becoming more of a standard research practice in many fields now. But I encourage you to do that in whatever project or program you're working on. Ask yourself who you are as a decision maker, a leader, or another team member on these projects or data collection initiatives. What's your social location? What's your set of identities? What's your relation to the people, the communities represented in the data? So here's just very briefly, the key findings from our research. So when collecting, using, and disclosing disaggregated data, it's important to adequately consider and address both individual harm and community harm. So in general, the legal framework, and to a certain extent, the research framework, are structured around considerations of individual harm. So it's likely pretty familiar to you to think about and apply meaningful, informed consent, and anonymity if requested. However, an important point that we heard from data experts was that these frameworks really haven't kept up with the global context of technology, in which we're all connected in ways we don't even know, really, through our social media platforms, our online shopping, our streaming practices. So what we might consider as anonymized or de-identified data, which is where that personal information, like our name, has been removed, the risks of re-identification, so of reattaching that personal information to the data, are so high. Other jurisdictions have applied more legislative and regulatory protection against these risks, but we haven't yet got there in BC. We have a robust framework within the Data Innovation Project of the BC government, and we did draw from that in our recommendations, but not those associated legislative and regulatory protections. And on community harm, which Kasari's example earlier speaks to, we haven't in general considered that aspect of the collection, use, and disclosure of data adequately at all. So our recommendations are designed to build on the strengths of this data and mitigate these risks. And so we landed on a three-pronged framework here: purpose, process, and tool. And I want to thank another of our key participants, Dr. Kwame Mackenzie from the University of Toronto and the Wellesley Institute, who stressed the importance of this approach. So disaggregated data is merely a tool to be utilized, perhaps, depending on the context and aim, but it must be accompanied by a process that supports the purpose of reducing systemic racism and oppression and achieving equity. And without that well-defined and articulated process and purpose, there's actually more risk of disaggregated data doing harm. So I'll just go through those three elements just to give you an overview. So the purpose here, I won't say too much about the first 2 points, structural context and structural change, except to say, obviously, these are highlighted in Kasari's Toronto Police example. But I do want to say a little more about the two key theoretical principles we identified that support this focus on context and change. So social construction and intersectionality, I'll say a little more about those. So social construction of categories, if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the primary dangers of disaggregated data collection is that it has the potential to reinforce the notion that these defined categories that we're asking about are biological. So it's perpetuating this idea of scientific racism or sexism or other form of oppression, instead of making them visible as social, political, and historical constructions. So for example, in relation to race, and this is drawn from the Ontario Anti-Racism Strategic Plan, racial categories are not based on science or biology, but on differences that society has chosen to emphasize with significant consequences for people's lives. People can be racialized, in other words, constructed as a race, not only based on skin color, but also other perceived characteristics such as their culture, language, customs, ancestry, country, or place of origin, or religion, as is the case with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. For instance, whiteness as a racial category in North America did not historically include Italians and Eastern Europeans, but now it generally does. So this applies to all demographic categories, this idea of social construction, even those that you may take for granted as fundamentally biological and natural, like male and female, man and woman. These have been constructed through through many means, but through the erasure of intersex bodies, for one. So applying this tool, the collection of disaggregated data, must be rooted in this understanding. You might still apply the same demographic categories, but this lens will change the analysis of the data. And then the second key concept here, intersectionality matters. We are more than one thing, we hold more than one identity, and they intersect in varied ways, with every one of us experiencing both oppression and privilege in some way. Intersectionality is a concept attributed to Kimberly Crenshaw and other critical race theorists. I like this approach to intersectionality here from Elena Hankivsky, School of Public Policy, SFU, because again, it's a shift from the individual to the system. So here, according to an intersectionality perspective, inequities are never the result of single distinct factors. Rather, they are the outcome of intersections of different social locations, power relations, and experiences. So for example, if we're looking at some of the data coming out from the US or Toronto on the impact of COVID on Black communities, it's so important to apply race and socioeconomic factors in particular to tell the whole story. If we don't do this, we won't be seeing people in their wholeness, we will not be telling the right story, and we will not be introducing the right policy or program solutions. So moving on to the process, the second piece of our three-pronged framework here, it's all about respectful relationship. And here we drew from some original Indigenous scholarship from Kirkness and Barnhard, and added to this from our colleague Sharon Thera, and I've been working with the 4 R's here: relevance, responsibility and reciprocity, and reflexivity, which is the shift from Kirkness and Barnhard's framework. And we're both attempting to apply this and also evaluate this in our work. So relevance, the relevant benefits and risks of data collection according to those communities must be heard and attended to. So data must be used in ways that communities want and need, which often includes a strength-based approach with appropriate indicators. So this is across the board, from research questions to specific demographic categories, relevance must be applied. Responsibility and reciprocity. So structural change must accompany data collection, including through the shift to data stewardship and sovereignty. So systemically oppressed communities are not merely engaged in consultation. We recommend a far more robust engagement process of establishing and centering relationship with community. And here, of course, we are grateful to be drawing on Indigenous frameworks like OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession as a primary building block here. And then reflexivity. So data collection, analysis, and use must include a deep and continual examination of individual, social, and institutional biases to ensure that that overall aim of equity is being met throughout. As we know, research practices are not value neutral, nor are the products of research projects. So true collaboration requires that constant process of reevaluation of assumptions, biases, and cultural differences of researchers and communities. And this needs to be built in throughout, and is especially important in considering evaluation and standardization of categories, as we drew out in the report. And I don't have time to say too much more about that. So applying the recommendations, as Kasari outlined, our primary recommendation was around the introduction of a piece of legislation to support this. But I want to shift a little bit from that legislative context to your context. So applying the recommendations in your context, much still applies from our recommendation set. So community governance is key here, fundamental to bring to life those 4 R's of respectful relationship, to establish that meaningful process. To what extent can you build in community governance? Data standards, each project or initiative within government anyway does equity impact assessments, and this should be applied more broadly, and we've developed some checklists that go along with that equity impact assessment, and this should be rolled into formalized agreements with that community governance board, so there's always those accountability pieces in place. And then we recommend using the 5 safes model as a privacy and security framework. So this is an internationally recognized model coming from here. We were drawing from BC's Data Innovation Program, and it's about safe people, safe projects, safe data, safe settings, and safe outputs. And just to dig in just a little bit more, not too much time here, into the data standards. We've got a checklist in the report to go through to ensure you're meeting all of these recommendations. And there's a lot more in the report, so I really encourage you to read through that section. But some questions I would highlight are these. So is the purpose appropriate and effective with community? You're not coming with a preconceived idea of what you want to do. It's really about community. What research questions are relevant to community? Is disaggregated demographic data the most effective and appropriate tool here? Perhaps not, once you've gone through some of the initial purpose and process questions. What other data collection sources, such as qualitative, need to be used? And it's very important to include qualitative data collection. We didn't spend much time on it in the report because that wasn't the purpose of the report, but it's so important to tell the whole story. What are the most relevant intersections in collection, analysis, and disclosure of the data? So really digging into that intersectionality piece and what are the most relevant aspects of that? And what categories should be included in demographic questions? The communities you're working with will know what categories will speak to them and will give you the most robust data. So I hope you notice that the tool of disaggregated data collection, use, and disclosure is the last thing I'm talking about here. And we really recommend that approach in your project. So maintain your focus on purpose, on process, so that we do this work differently in order to make a difference. And with that, I will pass it over to Gwen. Over to you, Gwen. You're still on mute.
Click, there we go.
There we go.
There we go. So thank you, Trish. Thank you, Shane, and thank you everyone for participating this evening. And thank you, Shane, for mentioning the concept of heart and mind. In the Ktunaxa language, Knilwitiatin is about thinking, but what it really means is to ask your heart. And I guess that's really the essence of what we're talking about this evening. And I want to thank the BC Human Rights Commission for doing this work and the province for asking for it to be done. And some of you may also acknowledge that there has been another report tabled quite recently in British Columbia, and it is dealing with anti-Indigenous racism in the healthcare system. And so, we're seeing the evidence there finally that speaks to what we felt for a long time. So data is a very powerful, powerful tool. Data, again, it has got to be connected to something to make sense. And when we were having the consultations, when the engagements were going on, I mentioned that I was the youngest of 7 children with 4 big brothers. And the concept of big brother in my family, of course, we know what sometimes that family dynamics can mean. But also for those who are of a certain age, you might remember the Orwell concept of big brother. And so as this was unfolding, and in particular, as a First Nations person, as a Ktunaxa person, I felt a necessity to actually bring a bit of our teaching forward in that I identify myself as a grandmother, but not just in biological terms, because in the Ktunaxa society, a grandmother is actually a role we play. When we've acquired a certain degree of knowledge, and that can be across many areas. I mean, I can tan hides, I can fix a car, I can sew a teepee, I can write a policy, but it's actually acquiring a certain degree of knowledge and then being able to use that knowledge in a good way. And so it's not just a title. I'm expected to perform a role within the society, expected to know what the good behavior is, to intervene in a kind way when I see good behavior not being performed, to show others how to do things in a good way, and to ensure that we can tell the stories, to remember, to remind ourselves. And that's what data does. It helps us to tell stories. And so the data we collect should actually be associated with telling those stories, helping to build the story. And so government generated data in my mind, it should only be used to improve an individual circumstance, to help educate, to help provide evidence to make good decisions so we can tell our story in a good and kind way. Roles of protector provider, of nurturer and policymaker, those were held dearly in our societies. And Shane mentioned to us earlier that the male in his society was predominantly the protector provider, and the women in his society were the policymakers. They told the men what to do. And it's really about that gender balance, really just in balance in general, just knowing that every human is in balance when they're owning themselves, owning their own identity, and acknowledging that the trends today in even corporate boardrooms are moving towards stakeholder benefit, not so much shareholder benefit. And so really understanding what we do as individuals, as groups of individuals, as organizations, as government, it should all be for the benefit and well-being of all of humanity. Identity's core to well-being and ownership of identity is self-determination. People are self-determining as a Ktunaxa people, but individuals are also self-determining. Self-determining, we should be the ones to determine what it is of self we want to share. And so putting our own labels on ourself is an important thing. And for the world to know who we are at that individual level is an important thing. But we've got to have protection for that identity as well. And as Trish was referencing, that there has to be good for the common, but there also has to be protection of the individual. And so when we think about data and the power of data, it is a very powerful, powerful tool. And if it's wielded in the wrong direction, it can cause great harm. First Nations and Inuit groups have inherent rights. We have the right to determine who we are. We have the right to tell the world who we are. Less than 150 years ago, there were scientists in my territory, in the Ktunaxa territory, here in the Kootenay region of the province of BC. And you can find their articles in European scientific journals describing my people, head measurements, arm length measurements, talking about our intellect. And so when others are reading about that, they're generating images in their minds. They're creating, their interpretation of who we are. And what right did those people have to describe us in those ways? Ktunaxa identity has been controlled by the federal government for over 100 years. At one point, we were called Kootenay Indians. We were put on reserves with names like St. Mary's. I've just told you who I am, what family I belong to, where in geography I place myself. And that, to me, is where I get my sense of belonging. As our identity's been taken away and other labels have been attached to us, and we've been homogenized and generalized, put in labels such as Aboriginal people, Native people, Indian people. Yes, I'm still called an Indian. In fact, I'm 60200380001 to the federal government under the Indian Act. So all of these labels that have been attached to me over the years are to be politically correct. have actually been not very politically correct at all, because the concept of being Indigenous or Aboriginal is somebody else's label. I know myself to be Ktunaxa. And so to be respectful, we have to disaggregate that label of Aboriginal or Indigenous, at least down to my identity as a Ktunaxa, so that when we are doing data collection and we're looking at what data attaches to the Ktunaxa, it's data that we want attached to ourselves and data that actually can tell the Ktunaxa that we are becoming who we want to be as strong, healthy citizens and communities, speaking our languages and celebrating who we are and our history and our ancestral homelands as we work together managing our lands and resources as a self-sufficient, self-governing Ktunaxa nation. We want data that attaches to that description so that we can measure ourselves against that description. We're no longer going to stand for other labels that attach to us, labels that are around things like disease. It's easy to measure disease. It's easy to measure death. And that's the way we're measured. For the most part, provincial and federal governments use disease and deficit relationships when they think about us and they measure ours. We want to measure well-being. We want to be the ones to control our data. And we want to, as governments, as First Nations governments, as Indigenous governing bodies, take control and ownership of that data. And we want to ensure that other governments are not the ones to open that data for public use through their open government movements. We want government to government relationships. We want to negotiate tripartite data government sharing agreements so that we can examine what quality data is and ensure that data quality is thought about in all contexts, that governments, federal, provincial, First Nations, territorial, are all focusing on the same thing, collecting data that helps to tell the story of well-being and helps to promote good relationships. So thank you very much for participating this evening. And thank you very much for accepting the challenge of being part of this change.
Thank you so much, Gwen. And thank you to all of you who stayed in our presentation today. One of the things I really miss about the screen is not on. I apologize for that. Oops. One of the things I really miss about being on Zoom is that we don't get to acknowledge the start and finish of different phases of our activities. And so I want to invite you to do an ASL class. And in order to do that, all you have to do is put your hands up and wave. And so as a group, 114 of us can all join in thanking the presenters for their presentation today. Even though we can't see you, we know that we're all participating. Thank you so much. I want to invite you now to add your questions into the Q&A function in the webinar, if you have any. And also, I want to ask you a question.
Sharon, very sorry to interrupt you, but your audio is a bit choppy, so people are having trouble hearing you.
Is this better? I've lowered the boom arm of my microphone. Is that better? Okay, yeah. I'm so sorry. I'm going to ask you to, or invite you to add any questions that you might have in the Q&A section of the webinar. The Q&A is right at the bottom of the screen, and please feel free to ask any questions you'd like. And we've got a question that we'd like to ask of you. And that is, we want to know if anything from the session today was relevant to you. Did you find it relevant in the work that you're doing or in your life? And if it was, could you please plop that into the Q&A section as well? We'd love to hear from you. So to begin, we've got a question. The first question is, what are the long-term impacts of collecting disaggregated demographic data? And I'll leave that to any of the panelists to respond to.
Maybe I'll start, and then if either of you would like to jump in, that would be wonderful. I think the long-term impact is that our policy and law and practice of our public bodies becomes aligned with who all those public policy and laws are impacting the most. So it's an alignment between experience, human experience and lived experience, and the structures that govern us. And hopefully the long-term impact is to dismantle some of these systems of discrimination and inequality that we're talking about through that alignment, through understanding how law and policy really impacts people on the ground. Because in some ways we operate in a vacuum on that, and policymakers and decision makers operate in somewhat of a vacuum. Gwen or Trish, I don't know if you want to add to that at all.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to just sort of add a little bit in thinking about the concept of democracy and participation in democracy, and that disempowered groups often don't participate in a meaningful way in democratic process. And this is actually a way to encourage and promote, and not just do that, to actually guarantee participation in democratic process. So I see this movement, the movement to claim identity and have governance broken down a little bit so that we can actually include voices more regularly and more consistently as part of our policy making in Canada. So I really see some hope in empowering groups that have not had that voice in creation of law and policy.
Thank you, Gwen. Hearing no other comments, I will ask a second question. We're getting a lot of questions about systemic discrimination and systemic racism. And so one of the questions is about how systemic discrimination is defined, how is it measured, what laws, regulations, or policies need to be eliminated in BC?
That's a big one.
It is a big one, yes.
Did you want to start, Gwen?
Well, I'm just, for me, it's really about knowledge. It's really that opportunity to build more knowledge out there across many different levels and many different domains, I think, and think about the systems that we all are part of, I think, and how this actually can help people become more relational. And I say that because I have this kind of a mixed relationship with the concept of ethics in the sort of how we relate in academic and other spaces, where we create some rules for behavior in a common space so that we don't step on toes. So if we're in a sandbox or whatever, we're not throwing dirt in each other's eyes. When in fact, the closer we get to someone, the more understanding we have of someone, the more we feel intimately related to them. And so the isms start to actually fade away when we get knowledge and we have understanding and we build relationship. And it's the compartmentalization by again, in thinking about solving problems and how we've kind of attacked that, rather than to create data to build better understanding, relationship, and really create an opportunity for different and diverse groups to work in collaboration, because we know that challenges, difficult problems are solved more readily and in a more appropriate and more effective way when diverse thinking is involved in that solution. So that's why I see it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gwen.
I thought it might be useful. We recently did submissions to the committee that is looking at policing issues in the legislature. And so we provided them with a definition of systemic racism, and I thought it might be useful here. But I'll maybe start with a simpler definition. I was talking to my 5-year-old the other day, and he used the word systems. And I was quite surprised to hear that come out of his mouth. So I asked him, what does that mean? And he said, well, things that just keep happening over and over again. So I thought that was an interesting explanation. I don't know where he got that, but that seems like a good starting point. Building from there, there is a definition. The definition that we provided to the policing committee comes from a decision of the BC Human Rights Tribunal. So I'll just read you that quote, if I can find it quickly. Systemic discrimination means practices or attitudes that have, whether by design or impact, the effect of limiting an individual's or a group's right to the opportunities generally available because of attributed rather than actual characteristics. It's not a question of whether this discrimination is motivated by an intentional desire to obstruct someone's potential, or whether it is the accidental byproduct of innocently motivated practice or systems. If the barrier is affecting certain groups in a disproportionately negative way, it is a signal that the practices that lead to this adverse impact may be discriminatory. And I think it's that one of the interesting pieces there is that disproportionate impact piece. And that's the piece that we can measure through data. It's not about, in this particular circumstance, we're not talking about whether one person treated another person badly. It's about what are the disproportionate impacts on a certain group of people that might be defined through some aspect of their identity. And that's what we're trying to get at here. And that's where we think there's some solutions to systemic discrimination and racism and injustice by addressing those patterns.
And Kasari, that definition is in the documentation on the website, is it not?
I don't know actually if we've put that somewhere. It's from the Campbell decision at the BC Human Rights Tribunal. And I've just seen that folks are asking for that in the comments, and I'll put it there so that you can refer to it, as well as the site to the decision itself, in case that's useful for those of you who want to dig a little bit deeper.
That's perfect. Okay, so we've got a question about who's actually collecting the data. The fact that most data collection is not coming from states, but from private corporations like Facebook and Twitter and so on. And the question is, does this legislation address the data collection by these private companies?
Perhaps I can jump in there. It's our recommendation was really targeted at government, because we were responding to this very specific invitation. But I would say that you're right, whoever posted that it is a significant issue to think through the collection of our personal data, as I mentioned, through all of these forms that we're not even really aware of, what's going on our computers, our phones in particular. And as I said, that's where you get because of the amount we're doing that and the various ways we're doing that, that's where you get into these significant risks around corporations linking that data in ways that we don't want to happen and that we're unaware are happening behind the scenes. And as I said, we don't have adequate legislative and regulatory protections here in BC and in Canada in general. So we did look at a model from the European Union. They have it's called the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And that really is a big document and set of protections around the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information by private corporations. And it's something that we do need to build in much more robustly in Canada and in BC.
And I think this is something that has to be brought to the open government table, because there is that collaboration internationally where we have made commitments to certain promises in relation to democracy, in relation to causing no harm and other things. So I think that there are places for us to put pressure on other jurisdictions as well, because it is difficult when you're dealing with corporations that are in other jurisdictions. We can do as much as we want in Canada and force our corporate bodies to behave a certain way, but that becomes, when you're dealing with data in the digital world, it's quite a spider's web, not just the World Wide Web. It is quite sticky and can catch you. So I think there's another component here again, and we think about the corporate pressures. And I mentioned it briefly in the presentation about the movement in Canada to start putting different pressures on corporate entities. And there was a publication out recently by the Michael E. Chin Family Institute for Corporate Citizenship called 360-degree governance. Where are the directors in a world crisis? And in there, it talks a little bit more about, as I was saying, thinking beyond the shareholder now, and really understanding what the stakeholder is in all of this corporate sort of world. And so it's interesting to see that there are some not direct links, but some absolute parallels here.
Building on it, sorry, Sharon, just want to add one quick thing, which is building on, Gwen, your spider web. One of the sticky pieces there is the federal provincial jurisdiction. So this report was aimed at the provincial legislature is who we were making recommendations to. And the mandate letters that it's shown up in is our provincial politicians and leaders, and they do not have a jurisdiction over telecommunications, it's called. So the ability to regulate, they're very limited in their ability to grapple with some of these issues. But as both Gwen and Trish have talked about, that doesn't take away from the emphasis for the need for this to happen, or some collaborations that might be useful in that regard.
Speaking about the federal-provincial divide, someone's asked about the recent release of disaggregated data on federal employees and whether we know if that's going to be done at the provincial level as well.
Trish, you were unmuted. I thought you might have an answer.
Have an answer. We don't know the answer to that question, so we will take a look and see if we can answer that later on for you.
So I do know in the certain aspects, not necessarily the provincial government globally, but within the Interior Health Authority, for example, because of our relationship with the health authority, we've put metrics to things like the number of First Nations Aboriginal staff working within their service centers, etc. So we are starting to collect certain levels of disaggregated data in order to measure those performance metric data.
Thank you. Thanks for all the questions, everyone. We're getting loads and loads of questions, and I know we won't get to all of them today. We have to end promptly at 7:55 to avoid a building alarm going off in your ears. So I will make sure that we are ended before that happens to you. We will spare you that, but we'll try to make our way through as many of these questions as possible, and then we'll also try to answer them afterwards, and we often post them as a FAQ after the session is over. Not tonight. I'm not promising that tonight. So I wanted to bring up this question about what gets measured is what gets done. So when seeking greater equity and inclusion in our workplaces and boards, what are some data points that we can track and measure? Asking this because often this begins and ends at tracking demographic data, which tracks diversity and not equity and inclusion. It's a really good question.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon, and thanks for the participant who contributed the question. Well, I mean, a first step is to start collecting that data on a voluntary basis in recruitment processes in all stages. So from initial application stage, we've done a lot of work at the office in really trying to encourage people to speak about their lived experience, their grounded expertise, and how it's informing how they might come to the work in the office. And so we see that reflected more and more through our recruitment processes over the year. We see that come out through the cover letters. And so from that, you can start to apply some demographic categorization and see who's coming through your door, which gives you a sense of, immediately gaps in outreach, say, if particular groups aren't coming through your door. And then you can, track through various other stages, whether, people have written assignments, interviews, and you can see where the attrition happens in relation to particular demographic categories, and where inadvertently you as an institution, as an organization, might be putting barriers in place for people. And then they're dropping out of the process. So yeah, I think it's a really important project in order to increase diversity as a first step within the organization, which then once you have people from diverse experiences, backgrounds, perspectives within an organization, then you can grow more towards an equitable and inclusive organization, as Gwen mentioned earlier.
This question really speaks to the notion of disaggregated data collection as a tool, and that the purpose is very separate from the tool itself. So thanks for highlighting that for us. Somebody speaks about children in social services being numbered and wanting to know, being told that it was about privacy and that's why the children are numbered, and wanting to know if any of us know about that system. I don't imagine that we do. So I think that that's something we can look up for you and respond to at a later time. We've got a thank you for a thoughtful presentation. And then a question about how do we ensure the protection of data so that it's not used against communities or manipulated? That's a big concern for many folks.
Oh, go ahead, Gwen.
No, it was just reminding me of when I was speaking with Trish in our early interview period. I was saying that, you know, the technology is there today. Why are we not involving the community, those people that share that common unity, that common identity? Why are we not involving them and setting the policy around that right at the outset? So if there's going to be data collected, we should be engaging people to just, you know, so have some input into how that data will be recognizing the ownership and control right up front by that particular community, and then determining how it should be accessed and possessed over the years. So the concept of OCAP, even though it was initially penned by First Nations people to protect our processes of around research, it has been applied within other populations. I know that the veterans group in UBC had got in touch with me about how, as a veterans group, they could ensure that the identity that was being presented and the data collected on them through various research projects, that they had an ability to control that post collection. So I think it is actually identifying the groups that share that common unity and engaging them, involving them, as I say, in helping to set the policy around the ownership, control, use, access, and possession.
There's a comment for you, Gwen, that thanks you and talks about how powerful your presentation was. And then the question is, may I ask about Indigenous data for our relatives living away from our traditional lands in cities and towns? So this is not technically a nation-to-nation discussion.
Yeah, it's just the concept of identity again. Identity is portable. It's not a geospatial thing, and so that's been a long-standing challenge for us. As we've been Indians that have been put on reserves, and so they've attached our identity to that space. And so our personal jurisdiction, as a nation, we have a personal and territorial jurisdiction. Our jurisdiction over the people, our relationship to the people follows the people. So my own nation, we provide services on and off reserve for all Aboriginal people, regardless of status or residency. And we ensure that their identity is recognized right up front. So I guess, again, for purposes of inclusion, it's to ensure that there aren't these policy barriers for people to actually reclaim their identity. So part of our process as a nation right now is to find those people who have been disenfranchised through the historic process of application of policy, and have them know that we are encouraging them to reclaim their identity.
Thank you. So we've got a question about how the provincial government in BC will actually use this report. Do we have a sense of that? And will we have a role in the implementation of the recommendations?
Well, it is built into the mandate letters of the Attorney General and the Parliamentary Secretary on Anti-Racism Initiatives. What that means, for those who may not be familiar with mandate letters, they're the letter that a newly elected a person that's been put into cabinet with a leadership role or put into a leadership role as a parliamentary secretary. It's sort of their marching orders, if you will. And so in those letters, which are publicly available on government websites, the letters refer to the recommendations, refer particularly to legislation around data collection, and refer to working with our office to do that work. So we are hopeful about that process and really looking forward to working on the legislation. And if I could just reflect a couple of questions back, someone asked about the balancing against the harms that can flow from the collection of the data. And one of the pieces that I wanted to emphasize, I think you've heard a lot from Gwen and Trish around some of the pieces of how we can protect against these harms. But I wanted to emphasize that part of the recommendation is around this purpose piece. So why are we collecting the data, which very much ties into the grandmother perspective. And how we've built that into the recommendations is to say the legislation needs to be tied to the purposes of the Human Rights Code, the Poverty Reduction Act, and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So 3 pieces of legislation where the purposes are essentially to grapple with systemic inequality and discrimination. And it's baked right into the recommendations. So I thought that might help that part of the discussion.
Thanks so much. Here's an interesting question. It's about, the person wants to get your thoughts on negotiating the tensions between collecting disaggregated data and attempting to decolonize the colonial categories as referenced by Gwen. For example, that we used to collect the data. How do we dismantle and navigate the limitations of data whilst using data? I know that's something we've thought about.
I know for my own nation, we have, it's been a real challenge because the data that we've had access to is all about disease and getting rid of disease. And our vision of what we want is about healthy and self-determining and all of these other terms. So it's almost like we're having to do a bit of an initial trade-off of knowing that we've got to measure certain things right now, thinking of certain things we're going to throw out right now because there is no purpose for them. And those proxies that are sort of in the middle ground of they kind of give us what we need, working towards getting better data. So it's really right now a focus on data quality and understanding that quality data attaches to quality relationship, quality environment, quality service. And so when we think about those dynamics and data also for my nation, we want to look and examine the determinants of health and look at individuals and families in that space of those determinants so that we can think about the multiple factors that actually lead to health and well-being of individuals, families, communities, and societies. So the limitations we have to accept, but we don't, accept for now, but we don't have to accept forever. And that's, again, the challenge that and the knowledge and the excitement, really, of this opportunity to really switch the control to something that is about care.
Thank you, Gwen. We've got time for one more question, and it's a question about process. The question is how we went about doing consultations in the process to ensure that there was representation.
Thanks, Sharon. And if you've looked at the report, you'll know that we didn't have much time to do consultations. So we're really encouraging the government now taking up our recommendations to do a broad-based consultation with many different groups. So the way we did it was we worked with, we ran 2 very targeted roundtable discussions. One of those was Indigenous specific because Indigenous peoples have a distinct history and relationship to the land and data, and also because of that are much further along in thinking about these issues and have developed, really insightful thinking around governance, ownership, stewardship of data in the collection use and disclosure. So we held one session specifically with Indigenous experts, and then one session separate to that with predominantly racialized community leaders and academics, and also disability advocates and transgender advocates as well, to really dig into some of the issues from those communities. And these were very targeted. They weren't open calls, public town halls. They were very targeted to people who thought a lot about these issues already and were bringing expertise, personal, professional, both, really those intersections. And so we learned a lot. And then we also held a number of one-on-one or one-on-two interviews, and those snowballed. We would hear from one person, you should speak to this person. And so we held many of those to really dig into as much of the expertise out there as we could. And most of those were leaders in BC, but we also drew on some of the expertise from Ontario, because they have gone through the development of an Anti-Racism Act, which is very much focused around data collection. So we could really get some insights and lessons learned from their experiences there. So we did draw from those folks too.
Thank you so much, Trish. And with that, that's the time that we have for questions today. We want to thank you for taking the time to ask such thoughtful and deep questions. And you did stump our panelists a few times there. So I think that's the first in my experience. We will attempt to find answers for you for that. I'd like to invite Kasari to say a few closing words before we move into the closing.
Well, in the interest of time, I will just say thank you so much for joining us today, bringing such wonderful energy. It's hard as a speaker. I do a lot of speaking on Zoom, and it's sometimes hard to feel the energy of the other folks. And I have really felt it through the comments and the Q&As and through the powerful words of my co-presenters and panel here. So I just want to thank you all for being here, bringing out 100 people on an evening for something about data. It just seems miraculous to me. So I so appreciate that. And I hope you have a wonderful evening processing all of these words and concepts. I know I will be.
We just wanted to leave you with a word cloud image that answers the question that we asked you earlier. And this is what came up for you. We had relevant and powerful and great and inspiring. I like shaking. It's so interesting. Rooted, change, it's important. And we chose the shape of the heart because the grandmother perspective tells us that we do this work because we care. So thank you for participating in that activity. In terms of next steps, we will be posting the recorded webinar on the website, and you will get an email link so that you can watch it again, because I know that's what you want to do. You want to just spend some time with us again. We invite you to share it as much as you'd like. And in addition, we'd like to speak to you about a little bit of data of our own. As we exit the webinar, we'd like to invite you to participate in our post-event survey. With that, I will take the biggest words that are in this heart and say thank you. Thank you and for joining us today. Hoichka. Good night. I wish you all good night.